All right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on the time zone that you're in, and as you're reviewing the video or you're here with the live session. I am Helen Thomas, and yes, I'm real. It's funny how I start meeting people, and they're like, someone just joined my organization, they're like, Helen Thomas. He's like, I've been watching your videos. So the word is getting out there about the YouTube page. I am passionate about this because the more I do it, the more I get into the information. And so I'm here to assist. If you have questions on how to study, that's what I try to offer. I don't regurgitate the study guide because, again, I'm in that gray area with ASMC or CDFM as I get used to the new name. And so I don't want to have any issues with that. And so it's us reviewing. And if you have questions, please ask, because there's others who have similar questions that we're going to go over. As we're reviewing Module 2, which is where we are today, the order in which we do the exams or the study group is Module 1, we did earlier in January. We do Module 3, then Module 2 is the last because it has a wealth of information. It doesn't mean that you can't pass it. It just means that you need to go through Module 1 and 3 because a lot of that information in those two is also repeated in Module 2, which is good because then it should be easier for you to just learn the new stuff because you've already covered some of the information. If you're studying for a module, do not simply focus on that module. Once you've gotten through all the material, like we did with Mod 2, we're getting ready to review Mod 2. Then after that, you now need to go back to Module 1, Module 3, looking for similar topics as what is in Module 2. Because on the exams, again, it's not individual tunnel vision modules, all the information overlaps. And so sometimes what you'll see is, let's say you're talking about the flow of funds or working capital fund. If you go in a different module, they might have 5 pages on it, but in Module 2, they might have 1 page. Go look in the other sections because it helps you to better understand. You study for comprehension. Study to understand the process. Tell the story. So as you will see, what I'm going to be doing with the review is, now that I've taken my time going through the material, now I'm just going to flip pages and I'm going to tell the story. And that is how I recommend that you do it, because you have to understand again what's going on, because when you see it again on the exam, it's going to be a scenario, maybe a paragraph worth of questions or stuff, and then they're going to ask you a question based on your knowledge of the information. All right, any question from anyone that's currently on the live session that you would like me answered or like to be answered before I begin? All right, I don't hear any questions. All right, so I may not say the page number because, again, this is an overall review. All right, so this is a DOD exam. So that means your headspace should be, okay, I'm working at the Department of Defense level. So the DOD's mission is important because that's how we get our resources, based off of our mission. So the mission of the Department of Defense is to provide security, safety to our nation, our country, our allies, neighboring forces. And so we have 3 military departments: Army, Navy, Air Force. The newest military structure is the Space Force, which was created December 2019. Under the National Security Act of 1947, which is important because it developed several positions. The National Security Council, so I'm writing these: National Security Council, the CIA, the Secretary of Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Because you have, what, 4 or 5 different important things under that law, I recommend that you know it's the National Security Act of 1947. I do not typically recommend people to learn all the laws and the years out there, but there are certain ones that are very important because of the information that is included. So the Secretary of Defense is the principal advisor on defense-related things. Who do they advise? They advise the president or the National Security Council, which is made up of those leaders, including the president. The president is the chairman of the National Security Council. That is if you want to say your higher command, the highest command for the country is the National Security Council. So I'm going to go with the flow of the book. And so under the office of the Secretary of Defense, you have several secretariats or the senior individual in charge of various roles. They have various roles and responsibilities. So several we're going to talk about: the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the DK, the Director of, USD for Acquisition and Sustainment. So you know the titles, but you also are going to have to know what are they responsible for. But before we get there, so we've talked about the National Security Council, we've talked about the Secretary of Defense. We also talk about the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So the Joint Staff, Army had its representative, Navy, and so forth. And that was the National Security Act of 1947. But it wasn't until the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 that they designated a chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which made plenty sense. I'm not sure why it took that long to designate one spokesperson for the joint forces. And so under the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is military. So they are the senior military advisor to the Secretary of Defense, to the president, and to the National Security Council. Do I have any questions so far? So again, it's a review. So at this point, you should just be able to look at the topic and just talk through the information. All right, so you have the chairman, and then the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff has a vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. He or she has several roles. So remember, your president is a civilian, your Secretary of Defense is a civilian, so your chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and your joint staff are all your military advisors, your military personnel who advises the civilian leaders. And so the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff has several roles. They are the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, or JROC, and we're going to talk about the importance of JROC. The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff also sits on the Defense Acquisition Board because they are a co-chairman of that board. And they also, let's see what else they do, holds the grade of a general, and they're second in command, which you can guess that piece even if you didn't know it, because if they're the vice, that means they're second in command. So the two other key things is chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council and the vice chairman. Although not on this page that I'm looking at, remember there's 3 DoD support systems. Everything that the Department of Defense does is categorized in one of those 3 systems. They have JCIDS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development Systems. PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. All right. I don't want to jump too fast. All right. All right. So let's move on to the National Security Council. You must first understand the role of the Department of Defense. Operational chain of command to get commanders to do things in the globe, in the world, designated commands, Northcom, Southcom, so forth. Understand that the National Security Council, they all advise, they all provide standards of priorities and things that they want to get done. The operational chain of command goes from the president to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders, civilian, military commanders. Understand that the orders of the president and the SecDef is translated to military terms to those combatant commanders by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So just think of it that way. So operational chain of command runs from the president, the SecDef, to the combatant commanders through communication with the Joint Staff. There are 11 combatant commanders that are responsible for various parts of the globe. It's important for those combatant commanders because they don't own the resources, but based on the priorities of the country will determine who gets the most resources. The National Security Council, our highest organization, is made up of the president, vice president, secretary of defense, secretary of state, secretary of energy, and the secretary of treasury. We need to know how to pay for things. The advisors are the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which we already talked about, and the director of national intelligence. Remember that the president of the United States is the chairman of the National Security Council. Once the National Security Council sits down, however often they do, they have to determine the priorities of our country, no different than our leadership do at our level. FY25 is coming up, what's going to be the focus, what are our priorities, and so forth. So the National Security Council does the same thing. Once they have completed that task, they publish the National Security Strategy. This is the focus of our country. These are our priorities. It's like an op order, operation order. It lists all the requirements for all the departments that falls in the federal government, under the federal government. And so the Department of Defense takes that national security strategy and determines what are the defense-related things that we need to do to meet that national security strategy. And so we come up with documents like the National Military Strategy, Strategic Strategy for Homeland Defense, how we gonna protect ourselves, strategy for how we gonna protect our allies, all of that. And we get all of that information, that policy guidance from the Secretary of Defense. However, the Secretary, we know, is not sitting down writing these documents. What's important, inclusion in what the Secretary provides, is the National Military Strategy. The military will be your cue to know who writes it. So the author of the National Military Strategy is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. It makes sense. They're the top military representative, so they write. So if you're asked who develops the National Military Strategy, it is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Who do we get policy from? We get policy from the Secretary of Defense. So all of these documents are combined into the defense strategy, which is the National Defense Strategy, which is a 4-year document. So every 4 years, they create a National Defense Strategy. The 4-year review is done in January at the start of the second term of that president that's in office. Any question? All right, so once we get the national security strategy, then the Department of Defense comes up with a national defense strategy. The Department of Defense has those 3 support systems to put that strategy into action. And so first thing they do is the Joint Staff will sit down on the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the JROC. They all have a representative there, and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is in charge of that group. They're going to look at the capabilities. We know what is said on the document we're supposed to be able to do. Now, the next step under the JCID system is to determine, do we have any capability gaps? Do we have any resources that we need to meet that strategy? So the JROC analyzes that document, analyzes our capabilities to see if they can pinpoint what capability gaps we have. When they're doing the analytical review, what the JROC is looking at is the .MLPF. That is the acronym. They're looking at doctrine, organization, training, material, leader development / education, personnel or facilities. They have to pinpoint, okay, where is the capability gap? Where does it lie? If the resulting fix for that capability gap is anything other material, it triggers the PPBE process, plan, program, budget, execution, for when they need to request those resources. If it's a material solution that's going to fix the problem, it triggers the acquisition system. We need a new aircraft. We need a new vehicle. That triggers the acquisition side of the house. And all 3 of those systems consistently works to overlap to meet the National Defense Strategy, and the National Defense Strategy meets the National Security Strategy. Ooh, I got it all in one breath. Ooh, okay, all right. So into the PPBE process. So we say that operational chain of command runs from the president, the SecDef, to the combatant commanders. The orders of the president and the SecDef is translated by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Well, how does the combatant commanders let the leadership know the capability issues they have? Since they're on the ground, they're actually in command, they're looking at resources on the ground. How do they let the higher know what they're missing? Instead of just verbal, they have to issue or give the leadership an integrated priority list, an IPL. So anytime you hear the word integrated priority list, that is the only organization, which is the combatant commanders, who publish or who issues IPLs. They give it to the SecDef, the deputy SecDef, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff got to make sense of it and translate it to the SecDef, and also to the military department that's responsible for that resource. Because again, we say the combatant commanders do not own the people. They do not own the resources. They just are command over those areas. So they have to let the Army know, hey, we're going to need these Army assets. Air Force, we're going to need these particular assets. So they give a copy of the IPL to each of those organizations, so that that military department can, once it's approved, included in the PPBE process, include in the defense acquisition system, so that they can get the resources that is needed. So, okay. All right, they hadn't started with P yet. So we're still on key individuals. The Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller is the Chief Financial Officer, the CFO, the Senior Resource Manager for the Department of Defense. For each of the major functions within the Department of Defense, you need to know who's in charge of it. And so understand the role of the USD Comptroller. And we're going to talk about some more in the PPBE process. I want to kind of backtrack a little bit with the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the JROC. The reason the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff sits as the Chairman of the JROC and the co-chair of the other system is to make sure everything is lined up based on what the National Defense Strategy says, based on the short-term goals, long-term goals for the acquisition. Their job is to make sure that you connect those two dots, that everything is in alignment to meet the national security strategy. All right, so before I say that, let's go ahead into the PPBE process. All right, so plan, program, budget, execution. So I said in the JSIDS, the JROC is reviewing the .MLPF acronym. If it's anything other than material, it triggers the PPBE process. Plan, program, budget, execution. Who's in charge of planning at the DoD level? That is the USD for policy. What is the final document in the planning stage of PEEP is the Defense Planning Guidance. So I'm just triggering the key things out of those areas. So in the planning phase, they're looking at the Big Op order, national security strategy, to make sure, again, that all the defense-related things are covered. They're looking at the national defense strategy. Now we're actually putting things into play. When the JROC determines the capability gap that's going to fix that problem, and the fix for that capability gap, they publish an initial capabilities document. They don't just say, hey, we got a capability gap in personnel. They actually publish it in an initial ICD, initial capabilities document, so that we have something hard copy to look at. So back to PEEP, the final document in the PEEP phase is Defense Planning Guidance. The next phase, let's see, yep. The next phase is the programming phase. The DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation at the DoD level, is in charge of providing programming guidance. The DCAPE comes up several times within the CDFM. DCAPE is in charge of updating the Future Year Defense Program, FYDP. They are also in the acquisition side. They provide analysis of the alternative. So the DCAPE is your cost guide or gal, cost analysis, cost benefit analysis. So anything to do with calculations in what things cost, what's the benefit, and so forth, your DCAPE is involved. So that might help to remember. So AOA, programming phase, Future Year Defense Program are functions of the DCAPE. In the programming phase, that's where you do the POM process. And later on, we're going to look at when things get to Congress, which offices in Congress are responsible for those. So kind of look at it as it moves up the channel, what's happening. So within the POM, the DCAPE is providing cost guidance as they develop it. And then in the Future Year Defense Program, it's a DoD database that keeps track of the DoD's mission. I think it's 11 force programs. So everything the Department of Defense does is listed under one of those categories. And then you have several appropriations associated that the services use. So the Future Year Defense Program is consistently updated as they move through the PPBE process. Once they get the POM process concludes, then that data, that information is handed off from the USD comptroller for the budget side to OMB, Office of Management and Budget. That's the next hire, because the OMB is the CFO for the president or the executive branch. So the USD comptroller reports to OMB. Under the 1921 Budget and Accounting Act, the president is required to submit a budget request to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. So you have the programming phase and the budget phase that are happening simultaneously. We can only ask for budget every year, annually, and then the program is also happening at the same time. The final document that is published by the Department of Defense at the end of the programming phase is the Program Decision Memorandum. Then the final document at the budget phase is the Program Budget Decision. So you could play on those words. And so in the budget phase, like let's go back. In the programming phase, the DCAPE is updating the Future Year Defense Program. The budget phase is the responsibility of the USD comptroller, who's updating the comptroller information system. That's the budget system that they're updating at the same time. So during the fall review, a representative from USD Comptroller and Office of Management and Budget, somewhere, like it says, what, September, December timeframe, somewhere up in there, they sit down and they go over the budget projection for the upcoming fiscal year. At the end of the fall review, once OMB has made a decision, it is published in an OMB passback. So when you hear the word passback, that lets you know that's OMB's final numbers that will be placed into the federal budget or the president's budget. Jump. On the acquisition side, let's say it's a material solution that's required to fix the capability gap from the JROC. So we go to the Defense Acquisition System. The Defense Acquisition System is the responsibility of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. He or she has a board that helps them to do all the acquisition work. That is called the Defense Acquisition Board. That is the board that the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff sits on as the co-chairman to make sure everything stays in alignment. Are y'all with me so far? Just telling the story. All right, anything in a thumbs up? Okay. All right, so we talked about all those terms. Yes. So 1974 Congressional Budget Act requires the president to submit the annual budget. Got that. Execution. And at the execution phase. All right, so we say that the programming phase is happening and the budget phase is happening. So eventually, the president has to submit the budget to Congress. The POM information also has to get submitted to Congress because Congress, power of the purse, they control the money. And so when we're doing the authorization process, the House and Senate Armed Services Committee is responsible for that process. I'm at Congress level now. So when the president submits the budget, the first thing Congress has to do is the concurrent budget resolution. They have to determine the guidelines that they're going to use to look and review the president's budget and what they're going to approve, not approve. So congressional budget resolution is the first step. That's when the Congressional Budget Office provides Congress with all the historical data. What was our revenue? What did we take in last year? What bills we paid? What was the do's and don'ts from the last few years? That's your concurrent budget resolution. That first step does not go to the president to be a law. That's just an internal action in Congress. Then the next phase is on the programming side is the authorization process. That's the one where the House and Senate Armed Services Committee is responsible for. The purpose of the authorization law, because it has to go to the president for the president to sign, is to authorize the programs, the category of things that the federal government is allowed to do for that fiscal year. Even if the authorization law talks about money, it does not give us budget authority. It does not give us any funding. It's on the budget side that we get funding under the appropriation law. That process also ends by going to the president for the president to sign for it to become law. So congressional budget resolution does not go to the president. That's internal. But the authorization, which is your POM information, and the budget estimate submission, which is your budget information, also goes to the president for the president to sign for them to become law. And then it gets approved. If both of them gets approved, the appropriation gets approved. Once your appropriation is approved, two things happen. Number one, that's tied to a law, is the Treasury issues the Treasury warrant. Remember, under Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, it says that no money can be drawn from the Treasury unless you have an appropriation law in place. So the legal part that happens after Congress appropriates the money is the Treasury issuing the Treasury warrant. That's a statement that simply says, hey, we've got the law in place. Your bank account is set up. You can start spending your money when you receive it, because you know we have to get our funding document in hand before we start spending. The second thing that happens on the administrative side is OMB begins the apportionment process. So whenever it's between OMB and the agencies, it's called an apportionment. The process looks like this. Once Congress appropriates, the agencies such as DOD, so the USD Comptroller must submit an SF-132 document to request the defense budget, the defense money. They have 10 days to do that. Then once they submit that SF-132 to OMB, OMB has 30 days to issue the apportionment. Then the apportionment goes to the agencies. The agencies will then issue allotment to all their subordinate organizations. Then everyone commits, obligates, and then outlay the funds, not disperse, outlay. So outlay is the formal term for when the funds are removed from the Treasury to liquidate an obligation. When we talk on appropriation, we have several appropriations that you interact with in the CDFM. You have MILPERS, O&M. They are expense type 1 year annual appropriation. They have various purposes. MILPERS, pay your military folks. O&M, you have some miscellaneous things you can do with it. RDT&E, which is a 2-year appropriation. Procurement is an investment type, which is a 3-year appropriation. military construction and shipbuilding conversion Navy, which is a procurement appropriation, both investment, and they're both 5-year appropriation. What does those years mean? The years mean that for those particular appropriation, the years are when you can enter into new contracts. 1 year, 2 year, 3, or 5. You also need to know, okay, well, let's say I have a minor construction project less than $2 million. Do I have to have construction money? The answer is no, because under fiscal law, you can use O&M funds to purchase do minor construction that is less than $2 million. That's the 2020 study guide. If you got an older study guide, that amount's going to be different and less. So make sure you have 2 million. You can also use O&M instead of procurements if what you're procuring is less than $250,000. You can use O&M. Talk about that. With the understanding the life cycle of an appropriation, you also need to know what can you do with the appropriation when they are in phase 1, current, you can obligate, new contract. Phase 2, expired. Every appropriation stays expired for 5 additional years. If it's a construction appropriation, that's 5 years. And it expires for another 5, that's 10 years. On the 11th year, it is phase 3, canceled or closed. What can you do with the funds in expired? You can make upward or downward adjustments only, no new contracts. So even if you have funds left over, you can't then go start a new contract for this current fiscal year. Phase 3, once they enter, cancel. Right now, as of today's date, we are closing out FY19. Now come 1 October of this year, those FY19 funds will be canceled. So what happens to those funds? It is taken out of our accountability. We no longer control those FY19 funds in my example. But the money's got to go somewhere. You got some money left. Those funds are removed from our accountability and returned to the miscellaneous receipts account in the Treasury. So don't forget, all the money comes from the Treasury. So once it canceled, it goes back to their accountability. However, you do have a 1% rule that also states if you receive, let's say it's 1 October and now we're in fiscal year 25, but I receive an invoice for FY19 and it's only $10. I have $10 in my current account. So it says I can use up to 1% of current funds to pay for an invoice on a closed account. For the appropriation life cycle, you need to know if they tell you what appropriation you're dealing with, and they tell you the current date, you then need to calculate if they say, when are these funds in the expired state? When are these funds closed? You have to be able to do that calculation. For example, if they say today's date is 2 November 2020, the first thing you need to ask yourself, what fiscal year am I in? If it's 2 November 2020, then you are in fiscal year what? For the two that are here with me, what fiscal year are you in? Because this is the part where people typically get stuck, where you got to first know what fiscal year you're in. Any one of you would like to respond? Okay, moving along. So if today's date is 2 November 2020, on November the 2nd, 2020, we are in fiscal year 21. You have just been given RDT&E funding. Okay, so RDT&E is a 2-year appropriation. So if it's fiscal year 21, then RDT&E is good for fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22. Then those funds are expired for 23, let's see, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, and then they're closed in FY 28. Did I do that right? I think so. All right. 21, 22. So that's what you're going to need to be able to do. And then if they say, what's the 5-year period that you're in the expired state, you got to say fiscal year 23 to 24 or whatever, if it's a 1-year appropriation and so forth, with your knowledge of the life cycle of an appropriation. Once you're in the execution phase, you're going to deal with project orders and Economy Act orders. You need to know the differences. I've been doing this for a while, and multiple people always like, yep, I've seen it before after we talked about it. So think of a project order. It's a project, meaning what it's between DOD components, DOD agencies, versus Economy Act order is intra-government. So it doesn't have to just be Department of Defense, any government entity. In the project, once you obligate the funds, you do not deobligate, because again, it's between the DOD, so I can always get my money back when I need it. But in an Economy Act order, you deobligate the funds at the end of the fiscal year. So those are the two primary things for project versus Economy Act. The term contingent liability simply means that if you have a contract and it has a contingent liability clause in it under outstanding contracts, it just simply means that there's a statement in there that says the contractor will deliver the equipment by the end of June. And if they deliver it before then and you pay them before the end of June, you get a discount. Or if you pay in 30 days, no discount. So these are based on verbiage that's in the contract, contingent upon something happening between the government agency and the contractor. Most of the appropriation we talked about, they have an expiration date, 1 year, 2, 3, 5. You also have no year appropriations, X funds. If you're looking at the line of accounting, they're X funds. The DOD's primary no year appropriation is Defense Working Capital Fund. The concept of the Defense Working Capital Fund, it works like a business operation on the civilian side. The business takes their funds to buy the product, put the product on the shelves. Based on how much it costs them to put the product on the shelf, they put a price on it. Customer comes in, pays the price. The money the customer pays revolves back into the business. So it's a business operation fund. It's revolving. But the difference between the working capital fund and the commercial side, they want to earn a profit. That's why they're in business. But on the working capital side, the goal of the working capital fund is to break even. So as, let's say, your commissary, which is a working capital fund, when they're looking at their historical data, if they historically earn a profit the last 3 years or whatever guideline they use, that means they have to start lowering costs or lowering what they're charging the customer so that they don't appear to consistently earn a profit. So these are things that is looked for. Your revolving funds have 2 categories. Your working capital fund. It's either stock funds, which is your supply management, or industrial funds, which is non-supply. Talked about that. Excuse me. All right, so that's, we talked about apportionment, flow of funds. Make sure you know the terms. Reference the flow of funds, appropriation, apportionment, allotment, commit, obligate, outlay. You need to know that order. The reason is you're not going to see it. The question is not going to ask you what order they come in. However, if they say, what is the unallotted amount? That means you need to know what step came before the allotment. That is your apportionment. So portion came before allotment. So if they ask you what is not allotted, you got to be able to subtract the allotted amount from the apportioned amount. So let's say they juggle. I'm sorry. I always laugh at myself. Let's say they don't put it in the flow of funds in the order for you. They just mixed it all up. The first thing you need to do is remember, Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, DOD issues allotment, commit, obligate, outlay. So that if they start asking you unapportioned, unallotted, unpaid obligation, your paid obligations, if you have it in order, it's easier for you to visualize what they're asking you. Not only do we have working capital funds, appropriated funds, we also have non-appropriated funds. That means Congress does not appropriate annual funds for these functions. On most of your installations, you have the morale, welfare, and recreation, your MWR. Those are your NAV, non-appropriated. They get some NAV. But depending on the category of those funds will determine, is it some appropriated, all appropriated, or no appropriated funds. Category A is all appropriated. Those are the mission sustaining programs within that particular organization, facility, installation. Some examples given is your library, the facilities. So I'm thinking your physical, your gyms, that's on the installation. Those are category A. They are 100% appropriated. Category B is 65% appropriated, 35% NAV. Some examples of your category B are your community support programs. They help with psychological, physiological needs of the service members and their family or that community. Category C is 100% NAF. That means no appropriated funds. Revenue generating programs such as your bowling alley, your fishing, where you got to pay a fee to go fish. They take that money, put it back in there. Boating, hunting, those particular are category C type of events. I'm listing examples because in the event they have the categories and they have a list of events. You may be asked, is this category A, B, or C? And so that's why we go that route. The cost and economic analysis starts off again by reminding you that you have the 3 DoD support system. It is focusing now on the solution to fill that capability gap becomes a material solution. So that is your trigger to start the acquisition process. In the acquisition process, you have phases and milestones. And if you do plan to go on to module 4 later, focus on module 2.2 is going to go in that detail. All right, so now we know what the capability gap needs to do. Now we need to figure out how to build that aircraft. So we need to start off with the material solution phase. We need to analyze different courses of action that will solve our problem. And so we need to know what the system needs to do. What are the system attributes? What does it need? How does it need to perform? Performance parameters. And then what am I comparing the different alternatives by? What is my analysis of the alternative? That means I have to have a list of things that I'm checking off for each of the alternatives to determine which one will best fix the problem. In the acquisition side of the house, after each phase or major milestone, you have decision points. So after material solution analysis phase, when we're looking at different courses of actions, then the result is presented in milestone A. We take it to the milestone decision authority. That's the senior acquisition person. If it's at the DOD level, it's the USD A&S, acquisition and sustainment. Or it can be the acquisition person at the component level, the Army acquisition, depending on how much that item costs. Once the milestone decision authority at milestone A approves and says, okay, let's go on to the next phase. We like these results. Your recommendation to fix the course of action, check. Let's go to technology maturation and risk reduction. That's when we're trying to figure out to control the technology risk. They're wargaming. They're taking that fix for the problem, that alternative, and then they're deciding all the risk associated with that decision, making that aircraft. And decisions are made at that point. The key here is to understand, just because we started the material solution analysis to come up with an alternative, we made a decision in milestone A to reduce the risk in technology. This does not mean that a formal acquisition program has begun. It is not until you get to milestone B, after they get the data at the end of technology maturation and risk reduction, it's presented at milestone B. The decision makers or milestone decision authority will then determine, yes, now we enter into a full-fledged acquisition program. I approve for you to move on to the next step. It is important to identify that in milestone B, they also have to determine how much aircraft are we going to build initially? What's the number? We may need 100, but we're not going to build 100 up front because we don't know if it's going to fix the problem until we put it in action. And so the low rate initial production, the LRIP, is the quantity or scope of what we're going to build initially. The LRIP is identified at milestone B. So what you're going to need to know is for each phase and milestone, what is going on in that area. Once the decision is made, that decision is published in an acquisition decision memorandum. So they have to come up with the baseline, the starting point before you move on to development. The LRIP, that's the quantity of the equipment or that aircraft that I'm going to build, and I'm going to publish it all in the ADM. The next phase is the engineering and manufacturing development phase. The purpose is to start developing that aircraft. We need to start building it based on the specifications identified early on in the process. So in material solution analysis, I'm probably using RDT&E funds. RDT&E funds in technology. Once I get to engineering and manufacturing, I'm switching from RDT&E to procurement. I'm start buying parts, buying things to start developing. So we develop some of the aircrafts in the process, and we need to test them. Developmental test and evaluation is conducted. After the EMD phase, milestone C. All the milestones are decision points. You can't move on from one step to the next unless a decision is made. So at the end of milestone C, once the milestone decision authority approves, they approve for you to move on to production and deployment. Production and deployment is to achieve operational capability. So now we started from scratch building it. Now we need to actually complete it, put all the pieces together, because we're getting ready to put it in the field. We're going to develop the LRIP, that number we identified in milestone B. We're now going to develop those aircraft, the LRIP, and a decision is made. So we're not developing the 100. Let's say our LRIP was 10. Now they're actually, because I'm sure aircraft has technology stuff they got to put in there. They got to build the body of the aircraft. Those are all the individual pieces. Production and deployment. Now we have those pieces. We need to turn them on to see if they work. So initial operational capability occurs in this phase. At the end of that, we have another decision point. So it's not a milestone, but it's called the full rate production decision point. Before we move on to develop the other 90 aircrafts, we need to look at the data from the first 10. And so that's done at the full rate production. If they like all the numbers, they look at the cost, schedule, performance, and everything looks good, and the milestone decision authority approves, then they move on to operations and support. In the operations and support is when we move into full operational capability. We start building all of the additional aircraft. The operations and support, if you're ever asked which one is the most expensive phase, it's your operations and support. Why? Because their life cycle for that aircraft might be 20 years. It might take you 5 years to build it and 20 more years to sustain it. So the most expensive is typically your operations and support. So production and deployment, I'm using procurement and MILCON dollars. Operations and support, I'm using O&M and MILPERS to sustain. And then I have to dispose of the equipment at the end of the life cycle, and I'm using O&M to do that. There are several acquisition categories. So as I mentioned earlier, depending on the dollar threshold will determine if it stays at the component level or it moves up as a DoD level program. So you need to know the acquisition categories. So we have acquisition category 1 level programs, if it's aircraft, vehicles, those type of things. And then you also have automated system. And I think everybody uses DTS, I don't know, Defense Travel System. So that is a system. So that is a ACAT 1A system. So the ACAT 1 tells you it's a major program. ACAT 1A tells you it's a major automated program. They have the dollar threshold in the book. I don't ever memorize it, but you're welcome to review it. If it's determined it's a DoD level, it'll be categorized as an ACAT 1 Delta, a major program that's the DoD level. The D behind it lets you know it's a DoD level program. That's the USD ANS in charge of that. But sometimes, depending on what we're trying to sustain or we're trying to build or acquire, it may be low enough to be at the component level. Those will be categorized as ACAT 1 Charlie, the C for component. So that should be easy to remember. On the automated side, you have ACAT 1A tells you it's a major automated program, and it'll be ACAT 1AM, MAIS, Major Automated Information System. So they could have made it easier, put 1AD for DoD level, but no, that would be too easy. So the MAIS is ACAT 1AM, to let you know it's a major automated system that is handled at the DoD level. And if it's an automated system that is handled at the component level, it'll be ACAT 1AC. So the C will let you know it's an automated system, A, and then the C is component. Whenever you deal with the acquisition system, always remember that you have program managers that's responsible for the day-to-day operations of these equipment or aircraft. There's a program manager for aircrafts. There's a program manager for vehicles. And so when you start coming up with the initial capabilities document, was the document we got from the JROC that says, this is a strategy, this are the capability gaps we identified, and this is what we think would fix it. The program manager now needs to take that ICD and determine, okay, if they say it's an aircraft, which aircraft? Do we have one already in the inventory? Do we need to build one? So that's the program manager level that will come up with that. When you're developing a program, you have to look at the total life cycle of that program. And so categories of cost is broken down by either appropriation. So either I need X amount of RDT&E, procurement, MILCON, O&M, MILPERS, or is it a WBS, work breakdown structure? I take the specific work that got to be done, and these are the WBS associated with it. Or life cycle cost. Is it research and development, investment, operations and support, or disposal? So those are the different life cycle cost breakdown that can be used to tell how much the overall program will cost the Department of Defense. If you have a program that is an acquisition 1 or an acquisition 1A and is categorized as major, then you have to do a CARD, a cost analysis requirements description. And don't forget who your senior cost guy is at the DoD level. That is your Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, your DK. And so a draft card must be done in 180 days. Let's see exactly what it says, calendar days. And the final card must be done 45 calendar days before the overarching integrated product team meeting. That's when you have the different components, because again, you don't have they don't build it all in one organization or one organization. So bits and pieces of that aircraft is built separately. And then you have an overarching team that comes together to make sure that when we put all these pieces together, that we have the aircraft that we want to fulfill that capability gap. Two things you're going to have to know is the average procurement cost that you're going to have to calculate and know the formula, and the program acquisition cost. In order to know that, you need to know the life cycle cost breakdown. What makes up life cycle cost? Think from cradle to grave. Cradle is RDT&E. That's my development cost. So I know the idea. Now I need to develop it with RDT&E. That's my development cost. Number 2 is flyaway cost. What is flyaway? Flyaway is procurement of the prime equipment, the major part of that equipment. When I include the support items with that prime equipment, It is called the weapon system cost. You're going to need to know the life cycle cost composition. Why? Because if they tell you to calculate what is the weapon system cost for this project, you're going to need to know its procurement of the prime and the support items, because they're going to give you more information than you need to calculate the problem. So make sure you review that section. All right, we're still good on time. All right, cost estimates. So if I'm trying to come up with the life cycle cost of buying an aircraft, and the aircraft life cycle is 25 years, I'm going to need to come up with a cost estimate for that 25-year period in the future, total into the future. So there are different cost estimates that is provided. The program manager does the initial cost. Once you tell me what you need, what it's supposed to be able to do, I can give you the baseline. That is your program office estimate. When it gets up to the component level, then the component acquisition person does, or the cost person does, a component cost estimate. If it needs to go up to the DoD level, then you have an independent cost estimate that is done. So several layers of estimates must be done to determine the life cycle of that particular program. There are different types of cost estimating methods. And I'm sure, even though I don't see the exam, I'm guaranteeing you one of these is going to be on it, because every class I take and it deals with cost, it always has analogy, parametric, engineering, and actual cost estimate. These will be scenario based. So it's not going to be the definition and then you pick the word. It's going to be scenarios. So you need to know the key words. Analogy says, I need to build this aircraft and I have one similar aircraft already in my inventory. So I'm going to use that cost of that one aircraft to start off my price for this aircraft that I'm trying to build. Analogy says, I have one similar product already in my inventory. Parametric approach says, statistical method or top down says, I don't have one or two different aircrafts, but I have several aircraft that have capabilities that I need to put in this aircraft. And so I take the cost of those, the GPS, the cost of building the body for the aircraft. I'm taking these individual costs, physical attributes of the aircraft, how much it costs to put it on those individual aircrafts, and then that'll be my cost estimates to start off with. Engineering is bottom up because it says that I have nothing similar to what I need. And so I need to come up with the individual price of all the steps in the development of that aircraft. So that would tell you, if they say which one is the most expensive or time consuming, it's going to be the engineering, because you're going to have to start from scratch. You don't have nothing to tap into. And actual cost approach says, I have the same aircraft already in the inventory. I might just need more built because I don't have enough to do the mission. And so actual cost approach is simply taking the price of the current system to then say, okay, I need 10 more of these aircraft. So those are your cost estimating methods. Now, when you do cost estimating methods, you can use the expert opinion or the Delphi technique. Let's say you don't have enough time, which normally in some instances we don't. The boss says, you know what, we need to build this aircraft. I need an answer by 2 hours from now to brief the leadership. Well, In that 2 hours, you may have to reach out to the program managers, several program managers, and take input from each one of them, then look for similarities in their input to say, okay, based on guidance from the 5 program managers, they all seem to agree that this will be the cost for that aircraft. That is called the Delphi technique. It's taking the expert opinion. That means I don't have enough time to do that extensive analysis. And so I need to come up with an answer. I can't just say, oh, I don't have enough time, boss. I got to do something, so I can use the Delphi technique to do so. All right. So I think, because I don't want to start the calculation piece, which is the learning curve, I'll wait till next week. So I'm going to stop here for today. All right. For those that are online, do you have any question on anything I discussed? And it may seem overwhelming while I'm waiting for your response, but if you do that several times, I promise you it'll become like second nature. Individuals wait until they get to the study group with me, or they wait until they look at the video to look at the material. It's okay to open it up on your own, look at the topic, and just start talking about it. What do you remember? If you notice, I wasn't talking any particular page, nor was I only talking about the information on that page, because something else that triggers on that page was mentioned either in module 1 or 3 or somewhere else in the module 2. So when you study, do not tunnel vision yourself to only look at what's on the page. Ask yourself, what else do I know? Because in module 1 and 3, it talks about the budget going to Congress, budget resolution, and all of that stuff is covered in the other module. All right, so that's all I have for today. So if there, last chance, any questions? Okay, all right. If you have not already subscribed to the CDFM Study Group YouTube page, please click that button and subscribe. Leave a comment or just click, hey, like this video, because again, I need more action on the YouTube channel, so that what YouTube does is if more people are clicking, writing comments, is they start to promote it. As people go on Google and they start typing CDFM help, I need help studying, then those videos will start popping up for them because people are using the site. So I'll appreciate if you do subscribe. All right, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. I will see you guys again next time as we conclude review of CDFM Module 2 and in its entirety. Thank you all for stopping by. Bye-bye.